This episode is supported by MonsterJoysticks.com. Level up your Raspberry Pi with our all-in-one arcade kit using genuine Sanwa arcade parts. And OneClickPrint.com for your photos on canvas, acrylic, gifts and more. Local craftsmen and global delivery. Our guest today is very much a current game developer producing titles for the iOS, Apple TV and Mac platforms at his company Strange Flavor, alongside his brother Adam. But the foundation for their success has its roots firmly in the first generation of home micros. To tell us about his history in computing and what lessons he learned along the way to prepare him for a career in video games is our guest today, Aaron Fothergill. Welcome, Aaron.
Hi.
Hi, Aaron. Take us back to the start then, please, Aaron. How did you first discover computers?
It was a friend of mine who was a year older, and way back, you used to have to pick options for the third year of school, secondary school. So that would decide what subjects you'd do for your O-levels. And a friend of mine was a year ahead, and so he was in the third year. He said, "You've got to do computer studies, because it's a complete skive. All we do is mess around on computers in the lessons and go on field trips to places where they have actual working computers." And I thought, oh, that sounds good for me. I could do with a skivey lesson. So I picked computer studies on that, just purely on that basis. And a year later, I'm sat down in front of a PET, playing Space Invaders on the PET, and like, yeah, okay, I can enjoy this.
What sort of time are we talking about here? What year?
81, I think that was.
Okay, so This was in the UK. So I mean, the computer literacy project hadn't really kicked in at that point. So
no, we were learning Cecil, which was a brilliant language for learning. The Computer Education in Schools Instruction Language only had 14 instructions. And pretty much it was a good basis for assembler, because there were really, really simple instructions. So I mean, one of the instructions, by the way, was a line feed.
Okay.
So you kind of see where it's going on that. So in terms of learning how to deal with a computer in a ridiculously simple instruction set, it was brilliant. And of course, BASIC. We had 2 PETs in the classroom, which you had to go on a timesheet to get half an hour on after school and stuff. And we had a terminal link to Farnborough Tech, where they had a mainframe there running, and we were programming BASIC on the terminal there. And most of the time, it was writing down your programs on sheets of basically paper. It was especially gridded paper, so that you could actually write a letter or a line of code blocked out by things, so that the guy at Farnborough Tech could type it in accurately.
Oh, okay, so he typed it in at the other end.
That's it, yeah. Someone would actually type it in, and then you've got your inputs that you also put in at the bottom, and they'd type in the inputs, and then they'd send you a printout of the output.
Wow. Processing by post.
Yeah. Well, they also gave you because you do that like once a week, sort of in the lessons, and you get your results next week. And the problem was this was for both Cecil and BASIC. And if the teacher accidentally sent them a BASIC program instead of a Cecil program for something that they were marked as Cecil, they would still type it in into their Cecil compiler, and you'd get back basically a ton of syntax errors, basically, because they just blindly typed in. It's obviously whatever students are available just to type these things in and not care, and you just get back garbage completely.
Syntax error for every single line of code.
That's a week wasted.
Yeah. So how long would it be before you got a micro at home?
Actually, it took me 2.5 years, I think. Mm-hmm. My parents couldn't really afford anything. I really wanted to get a Spectrum, because I thought I might just be able to persuade my parents to be able to afford one of those. And I liked the colours. I just loved the adverts. What happened was they couldn't afford anything, but I just went over to all my mates who had computers, and it's like, look, I can write you games. I'd already started writing simple games then. I can write you a game, or we can start doing this. And and teach you a bit about it. So, because I hopped between lots and lots of different computers, so I learned all sorts of dialects of BASIC. I even programmed on an ORIC once, and you basically kind of learn a lot of different quirks. Things like a friend of mine, we was a neighbour down the road, so I got to play on his VIC-20 quite a lot, and started writing quite a few things. And then he got a memory pack, and all the stuff I'd been working on that poked directly to the screen suddenly didn't work. So we had to find out the fact that the memory pack moves your screen address completely. So weird little things like that. And doing that same technique of poking to the screen actually taught me that you could actually have programs that self-wrote. Because one of my sort of ones I iterated on a lot was the Star Wars TIE Fighter game, where you've got the TIE Fighter moving around the screen and you're trying to line it up and shoot it. And I was constantly writing versions of that. And my technique on all the Commodore machines was to poke the graphics directly to the screen memory. And one of the effects was when I accidentally got the address wrong, it poked this graphics all the way over my code. Because, of course, the code is in just another chunk of memory, and on the PET and the VIC-20 and so on, the code isn't actually tokenized or anything. It's just as is. So suddenly I see all these TIE Fighter graphics sort of splattered all over my code, and I go, ooh, I could make code that writes itself. Which led to an interesting sideline in modifying friends' O-level projects to sort of tweak themselves. Actually, it wasn't so much friends, it was actually people who annoyed me tended to end up with O-level projects that suddenly looked different at the end of the time they'd run them.
Some of the first viruses, almost.
Yes, yeah. I mean, I suspect other versions of me in different multiverses went down more nefarious paths.
So, in terms of the first computer you got, then you had desires for a ZX Spectrum. Did you get the Spectrum in the end?
No.
Okay.
What happened was my dad was in the RAF, so he got posted to Hong Kong, and basically one of the interesting features of living in Hong Kong was a place called Sham Shui Po, and the Golden Shopping Arcade, which was absolutely full of Apple clones. Okay. And this being the Apple II at the time. So my first actual computer that I owned was a Banana 2. And I've still got it. I think it might still run. The thing was there, you could buy a clone. They started doing PC clones as well from the early PCs. But at the time I was I got my Apple II, and because I was getting all the bits for that and learning as much as I could, I'd had the problem that the sixth form I went to there couldn't do a computer studies course for A-level. So I had to self-teach, but I was teaching the O-level students as well. So that got me out of trouble because I got banned from the computer lab for not doing my homework and stuff. The courses I was doing, and they had to unban me because the O-level students were dropping behind. So.
Now, I've got here that your sort of first break came with the game Jitterbug on the Amiga ST format cover disc, but this is March 1989. So there's a bit of a gap there between the Apple clone. This
is the thing. I spent 3 years in Hong Kong from 83 to 86. So that was kind of formative years in learning, especially finding out what sort of games I was liking to play at the time and so on, and writing all sorts of stuff. We got back to the UK and I was unemployed. So I was doing all sorts. I was actually working in radio when I was in Hong Kong at BFBS. And that's when I first got introduced to the Mac, because they got a Mac in. I was the resident kid who knew about computers. So I started programming on it. And it was like, wow, everything was very different. And like the way everything was like very much user orientated rather than teaching the users to learn how to use a computer. I could actually go to the people who are going to be using this thing and say, right, what do you do? How can I make it work to what you do? And that was a very different kind of way of thinking in terms of programming. And so I'd been doing that, got back to the UK, was unemployed for quite a while because we'd been posted to Devon, and I was somewhat overqualified for everything in Devon. and there wasn't a lot of computer jobs. I was actually looking to work in as a studio engineer because I kind of got into the idea of music and radio and stuff. And the games writing was a sideline. So I was actually writing stuff. Adam got an ST, and I'd started writing stuff on that, which is where Jitterbugs actually came up from. And it wasn't until 89 that really I'd started sort of shifting into the let's do something specifically. The other problem I'd gone was I'd been to I'd looked to start up a business, and the local sort of North Devon business advice people said, "Oh, games industry. Here's a load of data we have for the games industry from 10 years ago. It's totally not viable. You shouldn't do a business in the games industry." So, of course, I ignored them. I'd done Jitterbugs, which ST Amiga format picked up on. And at the time, Mandarin were doing STOS. And I'd been doing programming in GFA Basic, which was what Jitterbugs was written in, as well as I'd actually been selling synth editors. I'd actually been doing those for a few years. That was actually going to be my first business. And I've been doing those in the background, writing synth editors for sort of MIDI controlled synths and so on. Switched it to games because that was more fun. Started writing stuff in STOS, and then the Mandarin contacted me and said, "Well, look, we need someone else to run the STOS club and support people writing games on STOS." And they were doing a competition as well, which I nearly won. Fortunately, the game I wrote for that did better than the game that won when they released it as a pack.
Okay. So we'll just wind back there to Jitterbug. It was a puzzler, wasn't it? And it was the full game. Oh, it wasn't a puzzler.
It was actually a scroller. It was based on a Steve Jackson board game called The Awful Green Things from Outer Space.
Okay.
And the principle was, the Awful Green Things has this wonderful game mechanic where you got aliens invading your ship. It's a rip of Alien itself. So these aliens grow from eggs and start invading your ship, and you've got to wipe them out as the crew. And you've got a player playing as the aliens, a player playing as the crew. The major game mechanic of that's the really cool twist, is that you get a random selection of weapons, of which any given weapon will have a completely random effect for this game. So basically, when you first fire the weapon at an alien or use a weapon on an alien, you don't know what it's going to do. And then it may be good or bad, and then you know what it does. And then from then on, it's trying to find out what weapons actually work and use them. So Jitterbugs had the same thing. We did it so that you've got a zoo ship that's basically plummeting to Earth. It was a tile-based plan view scroller, and it was actually up to 32 players over MIDI.
Oh, cool. Okay, so that's where your synth experience comes in.
Exactly. That's another one. I'd seen a game called MIDI Maze, I think it was called. Yeah. It's like a Pac-Man in 3D with up to 16 players and stuff like that. Right, we need to do that because MIDI's perfect for that. So the thing with Jitterbugs was you got, I think, 4 or 8 weapons. I can never remember how many things I did for it, but basically the weapons would be randomized at each game depending to say what they would actually do. Some would actually capture the escaped zoo animals, and some would actually make them multiply, and so on, or some would just not have any effect. And then you'd run around and try and capture the zoo animals and get them to your escape pod and escape the ship before it burns up in the Earth's atmosphere. So it was fairly simple, but it was my initial kind of foray into playing with tiled maps and so on. And so on, and parallax as well. I think I actually managed to get some parallax in there, which I was quite chuffed with.
Nice. And it was the full game that appeared on the magazine cover disc.
That's true, yes. Yeah.
How did you go about getting it into the magazine's hands? Was it like sending your single into Radio 1, or how did it work? I'm trying
to remember, actually. I think I sent it into review or something.
Okay.
And I think on the basis of I might sell it, or whatever. And they approached me and they said, "Oh, actually, can we buy this for a cover disc?"
Oh, okay.
So I think I got 150 quid for that, and they sort of bought the rights to use it for the cover disc, and kind of that was it. And that 150 quid for me at the time was like, yes. DOS. Because I was on the dole, and it was, I was looking at starting at my first company and so on at the time, and that was a big thing.
Yeah. And then you talked about the opportunities that came about at Mandarin Software with STOS. So was that as a direct result of the cover disc? Is that how?
No, I think it's because I've been doing a few STOS games. I've been sort of experimenting with STOS and started work on Sky Strike at the time, and they were doing their game. What was it? Can't remember the games something competition or other they were doing to try and find. Basically, you had to write a game in STOS, some limitations on what else you could use with it, and so on. And it was like they'd seen, I submitted Sky Strike early versions of Sky Strike, and they loved it. So yeah, okay, it's going to be a shoe in here. And then they sort of partway through it, I think they said, "Oh, could you take over the STOS Club and start sort of doing that?" And I was like, okay, So I started putting stuff together for that one, and basically I didn't win the competition. That's a fun story in itself, but they put a pack together of 4 games. It's called Games Galore, of which was Sky Strike, Skate Tribe, and something Mouth, whatever. It's like a candy eating mouth game. So they were all like really good games, and they didn't have a 4th game, so they asked us to write another. So we wrote Yomo for that one. Which was a quick crunch project to write this sort of side-scrolling game, and that got released, and that actually did pretty well. And Sky Strike Plus, which was the full version of Sky Strike, because it was only Sky Strike Junior was on Games Galore, got released through Atlantis Software.
Okay.
Which was a popular budget label at the time. So that sort of did well. It was kind of a strange thing because I'd already kind of signed Sky Strike with Atlantis, but Mandarin wanted to put Sky Strike on a version of Sky Strike on Games Galore, but Games Galore was only allowing you one side of a disc per game because they wanted to get 4 games on 2 discs. Mm-hmm. So and Sky Strike was 2 discs. So we did it as Sky Strike Plus with Atlantis and Sky Strike Junior with on Games Galore.
Yeah, and you were running the STOS Club. Just tell us a little bit about that. Was that a case of you pay a membership fee to be?
That's it. Yeah, the idea was it was £10 a year, and you would get 6 newsletters over what increasingly became a lot more than a year. It took me. That's one of the things I struggled with. Was getting newsletters out on time. I must admit, I was terrible at that. And the idea was the newsletter would have lots of useful content on how to write stuff. But the main important thing was it gave you a phone number, which was basically a direct line to me, so you could ring up and ask questions and then learn how. And if you're stuck, you could ring up the helpline and get help, which led to me just automatically answering the phone in my sleep at some point because this was wide.
That's really interesting because we interviewed Francois Lyonnais not so long ago.
Yeah.
He talked about how he had literally no feedback from STOS users. He was just working away on the next version of STOS or Amos.
This is kind of one of the sort of problems was that because they outsourced the helpline, because they didn't have anyone internally that could deal with it, they also didn't want Francois to be interrupted because it was a lot of work dealing just with the helpline itself. That ended up with them being disconnected from their own product, I think. When Amos came along, I fell out with them over Amos Pro because Amos Pro was actually slower than Amos. And so it was less practical for writing games. It had a lot of fancy stuff, but it didn't actually expand what you could do. It just kind of made it slightly more nice programming, but slower. Mm-hmm. So we kind of fell out there. The other problem was that instead of answering their own technical calls, they were just telling people to ring me. So my number was supposed to be secret. Mm. And rather than getting people to pay the membership so they could use my number, they just gave them my number. It's suddenly a lot of my calls was dealing with people who didn't have a membership number. So sorry, I can't. Oh, but can you? So you have several minutes of like, look, the reason I do this is I have to be able to afford to eat.
It's not a free support line.
No, exactly, and surprisingly, that's still a common thing nowadays. People still needing to eat. Programming.
And likewise, you did run the Amos Club as well, didn't you?
That's true, yeah. So as soon as Amos came out, I actually wrote some of the stuff to go on the Amos package. So I wrote the Magic Forest game that was on that. And also I actually wrote the original Amos tome, because I'd written tome for STOS, which was the map editor for STOS, which I'd done as a third-party product. And that was doing pretty well. So they asked me to write a small version for Amos to go with it. The problem being it had to demo the menu system that was in Amos, the pull-down menus. And unfortunately, they weren't ideal for that. Francois really improved them a lot later, but the initial pull-down menus in Amos just didn't work very well. So it was kind of crippled by that. So we did that, put it in the package, and then I started writing the full version of Tome separately after that, along with Sprite X. So I was writing games and sort of writing tools for people to use with Amos as well at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Well, just to pour some petrol on the fire, the Amiga Atari fire, did you have a preferred user base between the Amiga users on Amos and the Atari users on STOS?
The users themselves, I think, were both pretty cool. I don't think I had a preferred user base as such. I had a preferred machine. I definitely preferred the Atari.
Okay.
Yeah.
For what reason was that?
I was an ex-musician by this point. I decided to focus on writing games. But because of the whole MIDI thing, and because it was a very, very capable music computer, and the simplicity of it for that as well, I really did like programming the Atari. The Amiga kind of was nice for playing games on, but it just didn't sit with me well as an actual work machine. Amos jumped it out of toy to actually you can write something on this. And there's some quite serious things done with Amos that didn't get shown. On the helpline, I dealt with one was a college that was teaching combat air control, and they were using networked Amigas to teach people how to do air traffic control for aircraft with bombs on the wings. This was while I was writing Jet Strike as well, so there's a whole weird clash going on there. And also a guy in China was writing using Sprite X and Amos to write the system that generated holograms for Chinese credit cards.
Oh, okay.
So there's a lot of weird stuff because it opened up programming for a lot more people at the time, because the initial versions of BASIC and everything on the Amiga were not stunningly practical. Mm-hmm. Like some of the initial home computers have been opening things up. And Amos really did open it up for a lot of people. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, you got all the educational programs that kicked off from people suddenly having Amos and being able to sit there and go, oh, actually, I can write an educational game for my kids. Mm-hmm. You know, that was quite a big deal at the time.
It's 11 o'clock for anyone wondering, from the bongs in the background.
Yeah, that's the bell of doom. I live right next door to the clock tower.
So you mentioned Jet Strike. I've got perhaps the first iteration of that in 91 was Jet Strike Junior. Is that correct?
No, Jet Strike Junior was actually the cover disc version.
Okay.
Yeah, we did part of the promo for it. We did a couple of different cover disc versions. Jet Strike Junior was like a training level and a couple of normal levels with a couple of aircraft. So it was basically take the full version and cut it back to suit for a cover disc. And we did a fantasy strike on the basis of if Jet Strike did well, we were going to do a full fantasy with dragons and flying owls and all sorts of weird things, level. Which I just did as a cover disc version. And I think I did a Jet Strike Junior Night Missions or something, was a third one for cover discs. Just as a pure, let's see how many cover discs we can get this on kind of thing.
Right, okay, because there's quite a gap from 91 to 93 when the full-blown Jet Strike.
Yes, it was 18 months of dev time on that. The initial version of Jet Strike was on for Amiga 500, and that was over 2 discs. And then we did Jet Strikes for the Jet Strike AGA and CD32, and a bunch called Team Hoy, who were published by our publishers. They were based in Holland, and they did a game called Clockwiser. And there've been various attempts of other people to try and port Jet Strike to the PC, but most people who see my code have issues. Everybody who's tried to port my code generally has gone mad or disappeared. So Team Hoy were the first ones to successfully take some of my code and actually do a port, but they didn't quite get it right for the PC version. Some of it doesn't quite play as well as it should, but it was a good attempt. So really the best version of Jet Strike for the pure Amiga is the AGA version, because that one we had quite a bit of time to play about with, and Nigel Critton did us some really cool AGA routines and the extra joystick routines and stuff, and we kind of got to go to town on that one. And of course with the AGA version there was no memory restriction as well, so we knew we had a reasonable amount of memory. And so we could open up a few more things there, whereas the straight Amiga version was limited by the half meg of memory sort of thing on the A500.
I think that's the version that Amiga Power said was the 28th best Amiga game of all time in 1996. So it was obviously very well received. And this was still developed in Amos, wasn't it?
Yes, yeah, it was actually a hybrid. I'd started on STOS of doing of using STOS and machine code. So kind of got fairly proficient in 68K. And by the time Amos came along, Francois rather nicely gave me a copy of the source code of Amos to play with once I'd started seriously working on Jet Strike. And one of the things, mainly because I found a bug in Amos, that if you had a main loop that was over 32K long, it didn't work. Because he'd used, he'd actually not used a jump, he'd actually used a branching instruction to do the loops, which was limited to 32K because it was only a 16-bit address. And so he negated the source code to sort of see if I could fix that, and realized the best thing I could do is just do an actual go-to, which did a straight jump, which was allowed, this 32-bit jump then, so that was okay. And the end result was I'm there sort of playing around, and I was trying to eke as much speed as I could out of the game, and realized I couldn't completely do it in Amos. So I started doing more and more machine code sort of bits. So I'd written quite a few extensions for Amos by that point. So a lot of Jet Strike was basically the Jet Strike extension. So there's a whole load of stuff to deal with all the sprites, and a lot more of the mapping stuff was a special optimized version of Tone. I'd optimized Amos to not do a lot of stuff that it did that made things a lot nicer to program in, but not so optimal when you're actually running it. So a lot of things were cut out. There were safety features for programmers. So basically, if you got anything wrong in this version of Amos, it went very, very horribly wrong. But actually compiling to it was fine.
Yeah. Oh, that's so cool. So you had your own customized version of Amos, which you compiled just for the purpose of your own games programming. Very cool. And then on the CD32, you mentioned you really went to town on it. You put a few extras in there. What kind of extras did you have in there?
Well, the first thing with the CD32 is we were the first game to do a professionally studio recorded soundtrack with vocals and everything, which was it not Amiga? Yeah, Amiga Power actually called Adam singing "A Crime Against Humanity."
So your brother was the vocalist.
Yeah, we had a thing of let's see who can actually sing, and Adam came out not the worst. But the thing was, it was a really serious soundtrack. I had a Fairlight Series 2 at the time, and Adam was really coming into his forte then as a proper musician. So he did most of the stuff. I wrote the lyrics for Drop the Bomb and Fast Jet Fever, and I played keyboards on Fast Jet Fever and the triangle on Drop the Bomb. And Adam sat down and recorded an entire album, which is actually available on iTunes and stuff now as well. He actually released the Jet Strike album last year. as a remix. It's on iTunes, Spotify, the whole lot. I think he did it through a distribution service thing. And Amiga, Matt Smith, who's a fan of Amiga Power at the time, has released an Amiga Power album, literally kickstarted last year, which has got one of the Jet Strike tunes. It's actually got Drop the Bomb as a complete unique remix on there. Because Amiga Power really seemed to, even though they kind of insulted Adam singing, they really did like Drop the Bomb. So, yeah.
Well, if you've got any links for those, let me have them after I chat, and I'll put them in the description so people can find them. Yeah. So, I mean, you're coding on the CD32. I mean, when the CD32 came out, Commodore were already in trouble at this point.
They were dead, basically.
They were dead. Did you get any support from Commodore in developing for that platform?
We got a dev kit, which was good. Which was interesting. As a dev kit, it was a drive emulator that you could plug in on the back of the CD32 that let you connect to floppy drives.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that was the dev kit. And then basically you had to hack in. The first thing we had to do was hack out the Commodore spinny up logo on startup, because that used all your memory. And the dev process for it was insane, because this was the really, really early days of CD burning. So no one had a CD burner. Commodore had a CD burner. So what you'd do is you'd write the first iteration of your game with as much data as you can that you needed to have on the CD running off the floppy emulator. So basically, you've got a couple of floppy drives connected up. You run the game off one floppy with your initial chunk of data on the second floppy, and you can have a CD in of your music, but I don't think it was trackable at the time. So we had the music on a DAT tape. We then sent the whole lot off to Commodore with a whole bunch of discs, and then they would transcribe the discs onto the data portion of a gold disc. And the music would then be encoded down on the music tracks. And then you get your first gold disc back, which you couldn't actually boot the game from, but you've now got data. So you put the gold disc in and then boot the game from floppy, and then read the data off that, tweak it, modify it, send them a whole bunch more floppy disks, and just keep doing that. And of course, it's like a 3-4 day turnaround for each one. So each build of the game, you're sending off and waiting a week maybe to get all this sort of stuff back.
Yeah. And how did it perform? Did did the CD32 stick around for long enough for you to get a few sales out of that?
Well, this is the thing, we got a decent amount of sales. I think we hit the top 5, I think, at one point. And my mum was quite surprised, because she'd been down to Exeter and went into HMV in Exeter, and mine and Adam's faces were up on the wall. Because we had a fan there, it turns out. I never actually got to see it, but we supposedly had a fan down there. And it did really well, but unfortunately our publisher never actually got around to paying us, and they declared themselves bust and got bought by, they'd been invested in by another company, and they claimed they had more rights to the money than us and stuff. So that's one of the bits where the decline of Shadow Software was when I was basically going broke by that point.
Back to the same old story. A man's got to put food on his table.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, from one great game on a failing platform to another, Zoop was a lesser known but great puzzle game, which I understand you converted on the Atari Jaguar.
Yeah, I was on the team that worked on it. I was working at, having shut down Shadow Software, I went up to work in Newcastle for a bunch called Electric Spectacle. There's one guy called Brian Pollock, who was a great coder. Yeah, and I think he's still doing stuff nowadays. But he was managed by a chap called John Cook, who runs a company called Bad Management, and he's kind of everywhere in the industry. He's a very clever guy, and he's a great bloke, and he has a lot of teams. Either he was actually part owner of Hookstone at the time, but he also managed his load of them. So he would farm out sometimes ports and bits and pieces to other people he manages, like Electric Spectacle. So he ended up doing this version of Zoop on the Jaguar. We were actually working on Demolition Man for the Jaguar, and that was going badly, basically because it was actually originally done on the 3DO, and Virgin had decided they wanted it on the Jaguar, but the 3DO team had all left Virgin, I'm not quite sure of the situation there. So we just suddenly got all these CDs from the 3DO version, were asked to port it. And I joined Electric Spectacle while they were already a year or so into that and struggling. And I had to take the audio stuff. They had all the voiceover stuff for the game done on these CDs, but they were all encrypted. So I had to crack the encryption on this and decode them. So we had then the raw audio, so we could use it in the game. And a part of the deal was that this game, that Virgin would supply all the resources for it. And we're sort of looking at this game thinking, well, we're never ever going to make any money on this one. This is terrible, you know. So I'm there, I'm cracking all this audio, and I finally work out what they'd done, cracked the audio, got the raw audio. It was all in Japanese. They didn't have any of the English audio. It was only the Japanese audio. So the good thing being, that meant they'd broken the contract and not actually supplied us with all the resources. So we were able to get out of the contract.
Fantastic.
So then, of course, we started on Zoop, and that was we got the PC version of that, and being done properly, they actually supplied us with everything to work on it, and it was rather a fun one. I was working on sound stuff for that, I think, because I started playing around with the DSP and stuff on the Jaguar, so I was mostly working on the sound side of it. Adam actually did a completely new graphics set for it as well, which the Hookstone guys loved. And everyone thought, yeah, we've got to use this, but Sony vetoed because the PlayStation version wasn't going to look as good.
Oh,
the PlayStation version had to look the best, so it got vetoed.
And how did you find the Jag? Did you have any affection for that platform? Or?
Yeah, it was a love-hate relationship.
Okay.
It was a fun little machine. Atari were doomed. Atari support for it was actually pretty good, but it was obvious that it was poorly planned. You know, the CD read was too slow. We looking at things like the flash memory storage. I mean, the Commodore the CD32 was bad. You only have 1K of flash memory for everything. You know, the Jaguar was a little better, but the memory cards for it would actually burn out after about 2,000 uses or something.
Oh wow!
You could only do a finite number of read writes to it before they burn out because it's early flash memory technology. The CD was slow and unreliable. The 68,000 variant of the chip, I actually found a hardware bug on the chip. The variant they were using, one of the instructions didn't work. And we had to tell Atari, and they didn't believe us, and we sent them some code. And we go, oh, right, okay, yeah, don't use that instruction. But the DSP was great. I really did like it. That was my first go at proper parallel processing stuff, and I really did like playing around with the DSP.
I don't know off the top of my head. It may well have been the same DSP as they had in the Falcon.
I think so because part of the dev kit was a Falcon. We have one.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So as we move then into the new millennium, you're credited on games such as Croc 2 and Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone on the PlayStation. These are games coming out of big software houses, so you've already by this point had to adjust to working in larger teams than you're perhaps used to.
Yeah.
How did you find that transition as someone who had spent over a decade of coding games from start to finish yourself?
I think I got lucky.
Okay.
With Electric Spectacle, it was a nice small team. The Electric Spectacle basically got consumed by John Cook and John Rittman's company, Cranberry Sauce. So originally we started as Cranberry Sauce North, and then Adam and I moved down to London to become part of their team down there because as they shut down Cranberry Sauce North. And then Cranberry Sauce then got bought out, or the components of it got bought out by Argonaut, who wanted to sort of fatten themselves up for an IPO. And so we all got taken along to Argonaut. For various reasons, I wasn't going to be on the project with the ex-Cranberry team. So I got interviewed by Keith Robinson, who was their executive producer at the time at Argonaut. He said, what have you done? I said, well, I've done all this stuff on Amos and Jet Strike and all these kind of things. He said, oh, right, we've got our own in-house programming language, which is like a scripting language. And their language was originally intended for their game designers to use, but it turned out to be a bit too heavy for them. but it was really good for gameplay programmers to sit down and write stuff for the games. So most of the Argonaut stuff at the time on what we called the Croc engine was based on this ASL language. So he said, give that a go. I'll drop you in with the Croc team, see how you get on. And I really got on well with them. So they'd finished Croc 1, started working on Croc 2, and I got to actually sit down and do nothing but gameplay programming. I didn't have to touch the engine. I'm not really an engine coder. So being able to sit down and just write stuff for sort of content of the game was a lot more fun. And there was restrictions on the language in some of the stuff it could actually do. But again, you having grown up on variations of BASIC, it's like, okay, I can deal with that. There are tricks and ways around and so on. Mm-hmm. I think one of the big thing that bugged me all the way through is it didn't have arrays.
Oh, okay.
So you had to do sneaky tricks to do arrays.
And then following that, you make the transition into the world of mobile gaming in the Apple ecosystem. Ooh. With games such as Flick Fishing, which sold over 1 million copies. Congratulations on that.
5 million sales, 50 million downloads.
Wow, huge amount.
Yeah,
huge amount of sales. That was released in 2008, I believe, with your company Strange Flavor. Mm-hmm. Was mobile game development a place that you found was better suited than to your old school developer roots?
Especially in the early days.
Yeah.
The weird thing was all the games coming out on the on the iPhone at the time were the sort of things I'd written as 10-liners back in the Amos days. so they were really, really simple games, and that was a case of getting down to what is the absolute pure element of a game that you can fit in this tiny amount of space. And of course there's a lot of programmers have been used to AAA games, trying to get their head around getting back into this small space of writing games for a very small amount of memory and a very small amount of disk space, because you're limited to 10 megs and everything at the time, which, old me back on working on the Apple II would be like, 10 megs is massive, I'll never fill that amount. Because by this point I've been working on the Xbox 360. So coming back down to 10 megs again was actually quite fun.
Yeah. And you describe the company Strange Flavor as a classic two-man game development company on your website. The other man being your brother Adam.
Yeah.
I mean, you clearly have a good working relationship to have worked with him over so many decades. Where do your skills and his skills lie? Is there overlap? Or?
There's a little bit of overlap because I've been teaching him to code for years, because I think it's always important that everybody on the team has at least some basic understanding of what's going on. So I was trying to be a musician and realized I wasn't good enough at it, to the point where if I wanted to be a musician, I'd have to do nothing but practice, which means I'd never actually enjoy it, and realize my skills lay elsewhere. But Adam picked up on that, because I got into it from like the idea of synthesizers and computer controlled music. I'd seen the Tomorrow's World thing about the Green Gate and stuff like that. I thought, oh, wow, that's cool. So that's how I got into it. And Adam got into it by me building up a small studio to work with. And he kind of took over that and seriously ran with it. So he developed himself into being a proper professional musician. But also his talents at the time lay in art. And again, he's developed the graphics side from 2D art all the way up now to working with sort of 3D and so on for all our stuff. So he handled the artistic side of it. I generally did the game design and programming side of it, and we kind of discuss on the game design. So there'll be a few arguments every now and again, but some of our best ideas have started where Adam's had an idea for a game design and fleshed it out. And then I said, well, actually, if we just change a few things here and there, and then he'll come back and say, no, but if you change that. Things like Airburst, for instance, started as the idea of being castles in the sky, very much like Warlords. And then Adam said, well, yeah, what if we make it balloons instead of bricks? It'll be a lot cooler. Yeah, okay, that's a lot more cute. And then the whole thing spun into a very different a very different concept from what it was originally. So this kind of thing where things go back and forth, and a lot of stuff, again, it's iteration. Again, things will kind of go through various phases, and we will scrap stuff, every now and again. Sometimes it'll just kind of come back.
Sure. And then just bring us up to the present day then. What are you guys working on at the moment?
Right. Well, basically, with Strange Flavour, it's now we've licensed most of our Strange Flavour stuff to a bunch called GameClub, who are a really cool new concept on iOS and actually now on Android as well. What they're doing is they're licensing all the old games that were really big hits on iOS that have fallen out of the way because the system's updated and developers just haven't been able to afford to or have time to update them and keep them working. So there's all these great old games that weren't available anymore. So they've said, well, actually, we'd like to license those, and they're now doing a system like Apple Arcade, but subtly different, in that you can download any of the games for free off the App Store, and you can play like a demo level or equivalent of them, or you can play. I think they've done it now with ads as well. You could play them with ads, but the important thing is if you subscribe to GameClub through any of these games, all of them are fully unlocked with no ads and no IAP. So you suddenly got, they started with 50 games. They're approaching 100 games now, I think, of all this wonderful back catalogue of iOS games. So we've licensed most of our games to them, and 4 of them, I think, are already on there. So Flip Fishing is now on there. There's Flip Fishing Redux. Warpack Grunts is on there. Spinny Wings is on there. So that's a fun, recent one we did. And what are the ones on there at the moment? Yeah, there's a few of us on there at the moment, and they're keeping on bringing more and more of them back. And the important thing for us is we were really struggling to get the time to keep any of these things up to date, because once you've got a whole bunch of titles like that and you're working on new stuff, we just cannot keep up with sort of adding content. So, and they've got a really good team to do that. So they're doing that, and they're sort of listening to the fans and starting to add new content. They've updated everything to high def, So that's a kind of cool thing there. That's let us keep working on some of our own stuff for future projects. But mainly so we can put food on the table, and because they're actually a good bunch, we started working with Shifty Eye Games, who are a new outfit in Calgary. So last year, I helped them port 4 games over to Apple Arcade. 3 released through Shifty Eye Games, and 1 was us helping another bunch called Cleversoft release their game Earth Knight. So we've got Operator 41, Stranded Sails, and a game called Discoloured, released under Shifty Eye Games on Apple Arcade. And because that lends me back to working on entirely Apple stuff again, so I'm quite happy with that. And of course, it's all 3 platforms as well, which is also is fun for me. And now we're working on a new top secret. I can't tell you anything about it yet.
And is everything that you do at the moment within that Apple ecosystem? Do you do anything on the Android platform at all?
I don't.
Okay.
GameClub are actually going to be porting some of their games to Android. So.
Okay.
So a lot of them are, the way they're licensed is if they want to, they can port it to Android. So they're just starting to open up their Android side of it. I've dabbled in Android, and it's just like, it's an absolute pain in the neck to develop for various reasons. And there's no money in it for people like me. I don't have £1 million to spend on advertising to get 1.1 million back. So, I just could never. We've really, really, really tried to do free to play, but we just don't have the resources and all the marketing now. So I'm just terrible at marketing.
Yeah. Why do you think it works better with Apple then? Is that because do they push product more with more emphasis on the quality of the product rather than it just being
that? Apple users tend to be in the mindset of paying for things.
Right. Okay.
Android is entirely based on the premise that everything should be free. The whole point of Android in the first place was, here's a cheap phone and the operating system is free and everything is free. And once you start with that, getting people to actually part with money or something worth money, like their time to look at adverts or whatever, becomes a struggle. Because Android is purely there to gather information for Google. It's...
Yeah. Well, Aaron, I've really enjoyed your story. Partly because your point of entry was STOS and Amos. And we hear so many stories from coders who seemingly do the impossible in the early 80s with just hardcore assembly code. But your point of entry was the same tools that I was using. It didn't turn me into an international game developer selling millions of copies of games, but it's nice to know that it may have been possible.
Yeah, it's always possible, yeah. I mean, admittedly, I started before that learning through sort of doing 6502 and BASIC and others. But yeah, it is possible to go in through STOS. And I know a few other coders who did start with STOS and Amos. Who've kind of gone on to things as well. So it is doable.
Yeah. Aaron, on that note, thank you very much for your time today, sir.
Thank you.
If you enjoy my content and would like to support The Cave while receiving a completely ad-free experience and access to releases 1 week before they go public, then visit patreon.com/retromancave and join the official Cave Dwellers. Thank you for your support.